The Biafran Children's Brigade and the Ghosts of Kwashiorkor. He girl who waited for rice. She sat by an empty bowl, staring into it as though staring long enough would fill it with food. Her name was Ada, 7, barefoot, and already acquainted with hunger in a way no child should ever be. But Ada was not alone. By 1968, almost 2 million Biafran children waited beside empty bowls. Their war wasn't fought with bullets, but with bellies. Their enemy wasn't the soldier in uniform, it was starvation. This is the story of how children became soldiers without rifles, victims without graves, and symbols without voices. How the world saw their bones on television screens and pleaded for mercy, yet mercy arrived late. This is the story of the Biafran Children's Brigade and the haunting specter known as Kwashiorkor, a word that came to define a generation's suffering. Before Biafra fell, before the treaties and the negotiations and the political speeches, there was hunger. And hunger, unlike war, showed no favoritism. It devoured the rich and the poor, the chiefs and the servants, and especially the children. We begin not with generals, but with empty bowls, because that's where the real war began. Before Biafra became a nation fighting for survival, Nigeria was a union stitched together by colonial hands, fragile, diverse, and unstable. Ethnic tensions simmered beneath polite speeches and election banners. The promise of independence in 1960 came with hope, but hope proved short-lived. By 1966, coups erupted, leaders fell, and violence swept across northern cities. Igbo civilians were hunted in pogroms that left tens of thousands dead. Families fled. Trains packed with wounded survivors returned to the east, with stories soaked in blood and disbelief. Among those survivors were children who had never seen war, but now understood exile. The eastern region, home of the Igbo, declared itself the Republic of Biafra in May 1967 under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu. The declaration was both political and emotional, a shield against annihilation. But Abuja didn't see a shield. Nigeria saw a breakaway state, and the drums of war began to beat. No one, not even the soldiers, could predict what that war would become. They imagined fighting with bullets and tanks. They did not imagine fighting with stomachs and skeletons. The storm was gathering, but the children did not yet understand. They only noticed that rice became rarer, milk scarcer, and mothers quieter. War is fought on battlefields, but it is also fought in warehouses, ports, and farms. Nigeria quickly realized that to weaken Biafra, they didn't need to invade every village. They only needed to strangle its supply routes. The blockade began quietly, ports sealed, roads monitored, air corridors restricted. Biafra was cut off from the world, not just militarily, but agriculturally and economically. Within months, markets emptied, imports vanished, salt, milk, and protein disappeared from the average household. Mothers boiled cassava peels and yam skins. Children chewed on roasted kernels for dinner. Hunger wasn't a side effect. It became a strategy. Food became as valuable as bullets. Bags of rice became bargaining chips. A tin of milk was worth more than gold. And then came the children's swelling stomachs, round, protruding, painfully deceptive. Outsiders thought it meant overfeeding, but doctors knew better. It meant Kwashiorkor, a condition born from protein starvation. Hair turned red, skin peeled, and bodies shrank into skeletal outlines. This wasn't collateral damage. This was siege warfare. And for the Biafran children, the siege didn't just starve their bodies, it stole their futures. When the adults went to the battlefield, the children formed their own brigades. Not of weapons, but of survival. In makeshift camps and shrinking villages, they organized tasks, fetching firewood, searching for snails, collecting leftover grains from abandoned farms. They scavenged rivers for fish bones, climbed trees for unripe fruits, and gathered wild leaves mothers transformed into soups to trick hungry stomachs. Some children became messengers, carrying notes across towns under the cover of night, too small for snipers to notice, too swift to capture. Others were enrolled into youth organizations by Biafran authorities to keep morale alive. They marched, sang patriotic songs, and waved flags too heavy for their shrinking arms. They didn't understand geopolitics, but they understood survival. In whispers, adults called them brigadiers of hunger. The irony was cruel. While the world debated politics, these children built their own micro-society where hunger dictated rank and improvisation defined strategy. What they lacked in strength, they compensated with resilience, the kind born not from training, but from necessity. Kwashiorkor was not a new disease. It existed in medical textbooks long before Biafra. But never before had it acquired such a haunting presence. Never had it been photographed, filmed, and broadcast into millions of living rooms around the world. Children with matchstick limbs and swollen bellies lined the floors of clinics. Their hair turned rust red, their cheeks sank, their eyes grew disproportionately large. Some stopped crying, not because they were brave, but because crying consumed too much energy. Doctors called them patients. The world called them victims. Biafrans called them children. But history would remember them as ghosts long before they died. The tragedy of Kwashiorkor was that it deceived the eye. To the untrained observer, the swollen abdomen suggested nourishment. But the swelling was fluid buildup, evidence of the body consuming itself. Their organs were shutting down. Their immune systems surrendered. Death didn't always arrive violently. Sometimes it came silently, gently, in sleep. Nurses learned to watch for a terrifying sign. When a child began to refuse food, not because food was unavailable, but because their body no longer knew what to do with it. That was when the ghost had won. In the absence of proper hospitals, Biafra transformed schools, churches, and community halls into emergency nutrition centers. Chalkboards became medical charts. Pews became hospital beds. Hymns were replaced by the fragile coughs of starving infants. Doctors were few, nurses even fewer, and supplies almost non-existent. Many medical staff were volunteers, teachers, traders, and even teenagers trained in crash courses by international relief teams. They rationed protein biscuits, cornmeal porridge, and powdered milk. Every spoonful was weighed against survival. Every child was a calculation. Who could be saved? Who was too far gone? Mothers arrived carrying children wrapped in blankets, hoping for miracles. Sometimes miracles arrived by air, small planes dropping food aid during the night. Other times, aid was delayed for weeks due to political negotiations, inspections, or outright blockages. The most heartbreaking sound wasn't crying. It was silence. Crying meant strength. Silence meant surrender. And in those clinics, surrender was more common than survival. Television changed the war. In 1968, Western journalists were granted access into Biafra. Cameras captured the skeletal children, the distended stomachs, the hollowed cheeks. The footage aired in London, Paris, New York, and Berlin. For the first time in modern history, famine was televised. Families eating dinner in Europe saw children who hadn't eaten in days. Parents tucking their children into bed saw mothers cradling children who were hours from death. It sparked outrage. Newspapers called it genocide by starvation. Students protested outside embassies. Churches mobilized donations. Musicians held benefit concerts. Celebrities made statements. Humanitarian organizations raised millions. But sympathy didn't break blockades. Cameras could expose suffering, but they couldn't deliver food. And while the world watched, the children kept waiting. As one reporter later wrote, Biafra gave famine a face. Unable to break the blockade by sea or land, relief agencies turned to the sky. The solution was audacious: a covert air bridge. Night flights transported food, medicine, and protein supplements into Biafra using retired cargo planes and volunteer pilots. The pilots took off from São Tomé under moonlight. They flew low to avoid radar. They landed on a makeshift airstrip at Uli, one of the most famous secret runways in modern history. The airstrip had no lights. Instead, villagers used lanterns and car headlights to guide the planes. Every landing risked disaster, if not from Nigerian jets, then from the unpredictable terrain. Cargo was unloaded by hand: sugar, milk powder, soy-based protein biscuits, dried fish, and medical supplies disappeared within minutes into waiting trucks headed toward clinics and camps. Each flight saved lives, but there were never enough flights, never enough cargo. For every child fed, another waited. The air bridge became a lifeline, fragile, insufficient, but miraculous nevertheless. Not all Biafran children starved. Some fought. By 1968, as manpower thinned and the war dragged on, teenagers, sometimes as young as 14, joined local militias. They didn't always carry rifles. Often they carried water for troops, messages for commanders, or supplies across dangerous roads. To the generals, they were auxiliaries. To themselves, they were soldiers. War gave them identity, purpose, and sometimes food. To be part of the brigade meant a chance at a meal, an incentive that revealed how deeply hunger reshaped morality. The uniform didn't always fit, but the responsibility did. One Biafran officer later described them as children who accelerated into adulthood because childhood became a luxury. Some survived the war and returned home. Others vanished, lost to combat, disease, or displacement. And because they were never officially registered, many became unnamed ghosts of a conflict that barely recorded their existence. The tragedy was simple. Even those who survived the battlefield could not always survive the kitchen. The war for global opinion became just as important as the war for territory. Both sides understood the power of narrative. Nigeria framed Biafra as a rebellious province threatening national unity. Biafra framed itself as a nation resisting ethnic extermination. Biafra had one unexpected weapon: the starving child. Images of Kwashiorkor victims turned global sentiment towards sympathy. Newspapers printed their faces, charities used them in pamphlets, documentaries put them on television. Critics argued that Biafran leaders exploited the images. Supporters argued they had no choice. How else could the world understand the urgency? Propaganda blurred into advocacy. Advocacy blurred into negotiation. And negotiation for children was measured in calories, not signatures. Meanwhile, Kwashiorkor continued its silent work. In Biafra, motherhood transformed into a strategic profession. Without farms, markets, or imports, mothers became innovators. They ground dried cassava leaves into protein paste. They boiled yams 3 times to extract every possible nutrient. They roasted termite larvae as snacks for protein. They mixed palm kernel extract into porridge to keep children alive one more day. To the outside world, these creations looked primitive. To the children, they tasted like survival. Women exchanged recipes in whispers, the way generals exchanged battle plans. They formed food-sharing pacts, where one household supplied starch and another supplied oil, creating meals impossible alone. But famine played by brutal rules. Mothers often fed children before themselves. Many collapsed in silence, making sure the next generation lived long enough to see peace. They fought without rifles, without uniforms, without medals. Their battlefield was the kitchen fire, their weapon, creativity, their reward, another sunrise. Historians later called them unsung heroes. Biafrans simply called them Mama. Before the war, children played with wooden cars, rubber balls, and raffia kites. After the blockade, toys became luxuries no family could justify. Leisure was replaced by labor, games replaced by chores, and laughter replaced by silence. The few toys that remained became symbols of the old world. A wooden car passed from child to child became a relic of peace. A harmonica found in a soldier's bag became a village-wide concert every evening. New forms of play emerged, games born from scarcity. Children made soldiers out of dried corn cobs, drew battle lines in the dust, and reenacted conflicts they barely understood. War became a game because it had become reality. But starvation doesn't allow for prolonged childhood. When a child stopped playing, adults recognized it as a terrifying sign. Hunger had begun to suffocate curiosity. The war didn't just steal food, it stole childhood. Humanitarian aid arrived through a mosaic of organizations: Catholic Relief Services, Caritas, Red Cross, and a newly formed French medical group that would later evolve into Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. For many volunteers, Biafra was their first encounter with famine as a geopolitical weapon. They learned to set up field kitchens, dispense protein biscuits, and rehydrate starving children with fragile care. They worked under bombardment, slept on floors, and negotiated with soldiers on both sides. Some came for faith, others for ideology, a few for adventure. But nearly all left changed. They faced ethical dilemmas unthinkable in classrooms. Who gets the last tin of milk? Which child receives treatment first? When does triage become sentencing? And yet, the presence of strangers provided something famine rarely does: hope. Children learned to say merci before they learned to say peace. Starvation did not happen by accident. It happened by policy. Nigeria believed the shortest path to victory was through deprivation. Cut off food, fuel, and medicine until the rebel state surrendered. Blockades, embargoes, and diplomatic pressures were deployed like artillery. Biafra accused Nigeria of genocide. Nigeria accused Biafra of propaganda. Both accusations held elements of truth, and both sides weaponized narrative. Foreign governments hesitated. To send food was to appear to recognize Biafra. To refuse food was to appear complicit. Diplomats debated ethics while children debated between hunger and sleep. The irony was brutal. Negotiations that could have ended the famine dragged on for months. Months the children did not have. When peace talks finally resumed, a mother asked a journalist, "Will peace bring food? Because speeches do not fill bowls." She was not wrong. Uli became legend. Carved between forests and villages, the makeshift runway served as Biafra's gateway to the world. No control tower, no beacon system, just lanterns, torches, and the whispered prayers of villagers guiding pilots through darkness. Cargo planes landed with wheels inches above uneven earth. They carried milk powder, antibiotics, blankets, and hope. They took off carrying wounded civilians and occasionally diplomats seeking negotiations abroad. Nigeria attempted to bomb the runway by day, so Uli became nocturnal. Children watched from tree lines as metal birds swooped in silently, their engines muffled by foliage. For the pilots, Uli was considered one of the most dangerous operational runways on Earth. For Biafrans, it was nothing less than a lifeline. One relief worker said, "Without Uli, Biafra would have starved in half the time." With Uli, they starved slowly, but they survived longer. Kwashiorkor's cruelty lay in its biology. When deprived of protein, the body begins cannibalizing itself. Muscle turns into emergency fuel. Organs shrink. The liver swells with fat. The immune system collapses. Edema, fluid buildup, swells the belly and feet, creating the tragic silhouette known worldwide: thin arms, swollen stomach, vacant eyes. Doctors documented stages: irritability, lethargy, peeling skin, hair discoloration, infection, coma. The final stage was often misread as improvement. A child stopped crying, stopped shivering, stopped moving. To the untrained eye, calm. To the physician, resignation. Treatment required specialized feeding, small measured protein doses. Too much protein at once could kill as surely as too little. Humanitarian workers lived with a horrifying paradox. They had the knowledge to save most children, but not the supplies. For every child treated, another waited. Sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes forever. War scatters people in ways statistics struggle to capture. Tens of thousands of Biafran children were separated from their families, some during evacuations, others during bombardments, road ambushes, or simple confusion. Relief camps filled with children who only knew their first names and villages. Staff created makeshift registries and pinned labels to shirts. Chinwe, age 5, from Abakaliki, hoping relatives would appear. Some children were airlifted to safer countries, Gabon, Ivory Coast, France, and Portugal, through controversial rescue programs. Many returned after the war, some were adopted abroad, a few were never traced. To historians, these children are listed as missing. To their families, they were never missing. They were just absent in a world that refused to return them. War steals many things. Among the cruelest is certainty. Religion had always been central in eastern Nigeria, but famine altered the role of the church dramatically. Priests became aid coordinators, pastors became relief logisticians, and catechists became field nurses. Mass was shortened so porridge distribution could begin faster. Sermons shifted from salvation to survival. Hymns merged with hunger. Church buildings became food depots. Schools became clinics. Convents became hospitals. Bibles shared shelf space with powdered milk and antibiotics. For many children, the first protein they consumed in months came from a church kitchen. For others, the last prayer spoken over their bodies came from a church courtyard. Faith could not feed everyone, but it prevented despair from consuming those the famine had not yet claimed. Nigeria's blockade was designed to break Biafra quickly. Instead, it extended the war. Global sympathy turned into political pressure. Activists lobbied governments. Newspapers condemned silence. Relief organizations grew more aggressive. Diplomats criticized the growing civilian toll. The starvation of children turned into a public relations disaster. Nigeria could win militarily but risk losing morally. This dynamic created an unexpected stalemate. Nigeria afraid to intensify the blockade publicly, Biafra unable to end the war, but unwilling to surrender. Hunger prolonged the conflict it was meant to conclude. The weapon backfired, and while policy experts debated strategic miscalculations, children debated whether they would wake up hungry or dead. In late 1969, a shipment of protein-rich milk arrived through the air bridge. Relief workers distributed it in small tins, each tin labeled with instructions in French and English. To adults, it was powdered milk. To children, it was salvation in metal packaging. Mothers mixed the powder with boiled water, stirring until it turned into a pale, creamy liquid. The aroma alone was enough to make infants cry with anticipation. For the first time in months, clinics recorded weight gain. The swelling reduced. Hair regained color. Crying returned, ironically a sign of recovery. The tins became keepsakes. Children used the empty cans as toy drums, cups, or treasure containers. Some buried them like sacred relics. One nurse later remarked, "We learned that hope sometimes arrives in crates, not speeches." Relief shipments were unpredictable. Sometimes planes arrived with medicine, other times with blankets. Once they arrived with bread, fresh bread. The smell drifted through the camp like perfume. Children lined up before dawn, clutching bowls, cups, and even bare hands. But that same night, Nigerian jets located the runway. Bombs fell. Panic erupted. Mothers shielded children with their own bodies. Some ran into the forest, others into trenches. The bread remained stacked in crates, untouched amid explosions. When the sirens fell silent and the smoke thinned, children crept back toward the runway. And there, among debris and broken crates, was bread, still warm, somehow untouched by fire. They tore it apart with trembling fingers. They ate in silence, chewing between sobs and laughter. In war, miracles don't arrive politely. They arrive between explosions. Soldiers left their villages with swagger and returned resembling skeletons. Not from battlefield wounds, but from the same hunger consuming their children. Uniforms once loose at the waist hugged their ribs instead. Boots that were once heavy now felt weightless on shrinking legs. Many soldiers discovered the battlefield was easier to survive than the famine at home. Civilians watched in shock as the men they once called protectors now needed protection themselves. Children offered them crumbs from relief rations. Mothers tore thin slices from cassava cakes to share. The lines between soldier and victim blurred. Hunger is an equalizer. It ranks no one. When a commander collapsed during formation, his final words were not commands, they were apologies. On January 15, 1970, Biafra capitulated. After 30 months of war, starvation, and isolation, the nation that fought for survival could no longer continue. The announcement arrived quietly. No grand speeches, no fireworks, no music. Just a broadcast over radio waves that children could not fully interpret, but immediately understood. The war was over. Nigeria declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished. The slogan carried both hope and ambiguity. Soldiers laid down rifles. Families emerged from hiding. Airstrips ceased nightly whispers. But famine doesn't surrender at the same pace as armies. Hunger lingers after treaties. Kwashiorkor does not vanish with signatures. Victory on paper does not feed empty stomachs. When journalists left and relief planes stopped landing, the real aftermath began. Children returned to abandoned villages swallowed by weeds. Schools reopened without chalk, desks, or textbooks. Clinics shut down due to lack of supplies. Teachers reinvented arithmetic using sticks and dirt. Children drew alphabets in dust instead of notebooks. Recovery became a silent marathon. The world congratulated itself for its humanitarian response. Then it moved on. It always does. Wars end on television long before they end in real life. And for the children of Biafra, the final battles were fought against trauma, not troops. Years later, boys who survived the war grew into men. Many refused to discuss famine. Some claimed they remembered little. Others remembered too much. When asked about Kwashiorkor, they changed the subject. When asked about missing siblings, they paused and blinked slowly. Not because they had forgotten, but because silence felt safer. Trauma often speaks through omission. Psychologists call it suppression. Biafrans call it coping.
Are you finished with
The war taught them a painful lesson. Sometimes surviving means forgetting just enough to keep living. From the ashes of starvation came unexpected legacies. Some children who escaped malnutrition became activists, doctors, and academics. Their memories fueled missions to prevent famine elsewhere. A Biafran pediatric survivor helped develop modern therapeutic feeding formulas used in famine zones worldwide. Another became an economist arguing for food independence policies. A third transformed into a filmmaker documenting humanitarian crises. History rarely grants famine survivors applause. But quietly, they reshaped the world that once abandoned them. Pain, when endured long enough, sometimes becomes purpose. Biafra changed humanitarian response permanently. Before Biafra, famine was viewed as natural misfortune. After Biafra, it was recognized as a political weapon. Relief organizations unified, medical protocols standardized, air corridor negotiations became common. The world learned that starvation could be prevented even during war, if only the will existed. The images of Kwashiorkor forced diplomats to confront moral responsibility. Laws were drafted, conventions debated, relief agencies professionalized. Biafra was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. The children did not know it at the time. They only knew hunger. But hunger became history's teacher. Memory is personal. History is collective. The two rarely align. Some Nigerians remember Biafra as rebellion. Some Biafrans remember it as survival. Some scholars remember it as geopolitical case study. Children remember it as hunger. All of them are correct, and none of them complete. History textbooks often sanitize famine, condensing suffering into statistics. 2 million died, but children do not die as numbers. They die as sons and daughters, siblings, classmates, neighbors. Memory restores names where history lists digits. Kwashiorkor leaves permanent fingerprints. Survivors grew with shorter stature, fragile immune systems, and weakened organs. Some struggled with developmental delays, others with chronic health conditions, but the most lasting wounds were invisible. The ghosts of starvation do not haunt through apparitions. They haunt through habits. Survivors hoarded food decades later. Others ate rapidly even when no one was taking their plate. Some refused to waste crumbs. Some panicked during shortages of milk, sugar, or salt, the very symbols of their deprivation. You do not starve only once. You starve again in memory. Many years after the war, Ada, the girl who waited beside an empty bowl, became a grandmother. One day, her grandson asked why she never let the rice pot go empty. She smiled, but her eyes traveled back across decades, back to clinics lit by lanterns, back to planes landing without lights, back to the day bread arrived amidst bombs, back to children marching on swollen legs, back to the day famine learned to speak. She did not tell him about Kwashiorkor. She did not explain the hunger. She simply said, "In this house, plates stay full." Her grandson nodded, not understanding. He did not need to. That was the point. The ghosts of Kwashiorkor do not demand remembrance. They demand prevention. The question history still asks. The Biafran Children's Brigade never carried rifles. They carried bowls. Their names rarely appear in military records, but their images change the global conscience. And the world still asks, how many children must starve before politics learn to feed faster than they fight? If stories like this moved you, then don't let history fade into silence. Subscribe to this channel for more rare and untold histories the world tried to forget. Click the like button if you believe stories like the Children's Brigade deserve to be remembered. And drop a comment below. Tell us what part of this journey struck you the most, and which hidden chapter of African history we should uncover next. By engaging, you help these forgotten voices reach millions who may never get the chance to hear them. This is Rising History, where we resurrect the past, one story at a time. Until the next episode, time will keep moving, but history must never disappear.